At 20, Claire Dawson was homeless after discovering the father she had just buried had secretly left their home buried in debt. With nowhere to go but her aging SUV, she spent her last $100 on an abandoned Idaho fire lookout everyone else considered worthless. People laughed and called it a staircase to nowhere. Then her dog, Ranger, began clawing at one loose floorboard beneath it. Claire found a rusted, hidden box bearing her own last name, and what she discovered inside would change everything she believed about her family. But before we open it, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? I hope you're having a wonderful day. And if you enjoy hidden family mysteries like this one, subscribe to the channel. And now, let's begin. The foreclosure notice arrived 18 days after Claire Dawson buried her father. She found the envelope wedged between an electric bill and a grocery flyer, addressed to Michael Dawson, even though everyone who mattered already knew Michael was dead. Claire almost added it to the stack of mail she had stopped opening. Then she saw the words, "Final Notice," through the envelope window. Ranger followed her into the kitchen and settled beside Michael's empty chair while Claire tore it open. She read the first page once, then again, more slowly. The house was collateral for a debt. Payments were months behind. Unless the outstanding amount was resolved, foreclosure proceedings would continue. Claire sat down. No. Ranger lifted his head. Her father had never mentioned a loan. Michael complained about grocery prices and heating bills, but whenever Claire asked whether they were okay, he gave the same answer: "We're managing." She called the number on the notice and spent most of the morning being transferred between departments. By noon, the truth was unavoidable. The debt was real. Michael had borrowed against the house over several years. The balance was far beyond Claire's savings, and there was no hidden insurance payment coming to rescue her. She tried everything she understood how to try. She asked about assuming the loan, extending payments, delaying foreclosure. She carried folders between offices and sat across from people who spoke gently while explaining numbers that did not become smaller because she was 20 and grieving. Claire had enough money to survive for a while. She did not have enough to save the house. That night, she sat on Michael's bedroom floor surrounded by paperwork. Ranger lay with his head across her ankle. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered. The dog looked toward the empty bed. Claire wanted to be angry only about the money. Instead, she was angry about every ordinary evening when Michael had sat across from her pretending nothing was wrong. She had thought the house was the one thing he had left secure. Now even that memory felt mortgaged. When the deadline came, Claire packed. She kept photographs, clothes, documents, Ranger's things, a few kitchen items, and what could fit into plastic bins. Everything else had to be sold, donated, or abandoned. Ranger became restless as the rooms emptied. On the final morning, he walked into the living room and lay beside Michael's chair, which Claire had been unable to sell. "We can't take it," she told him. Ranger did not move. Claire crouched and buried her face against his neck. "I know," she cried then, not because of the chair, but because there was no longer anything left to postpone. By afternoon, her aging SUV contained nearly everything she owned. Claire stood in the driveway with the keys in her hand and looked at the little house one last time. She had expected grief after Michael died. She had not expected him to leave behind a secret capable of taking the roof with him. For the next several nights, Claire slept in the SUV. Finding somewhere cheap to rent was harder with Ranger. One landlord rejected dogs over 40 pounds. Another wanted a deposit Claire could not afford. A third room looked possible until the owner saw Ranger through the window. No large animals. "He's quiet." Still no. Ranger waited in the SUV afterward, tail thumping when Claire climbed in. "Apparently you're ruining my housing prospects," she said. He licked her hand. She smiled despite herself. "Yeah, I'm keeping you." Claire used public Wi-Fi to search listings and temporary work. That was how she found the county surplus auction notice. Most items were equipment. Small parcels and structures she ignored until one photograph stopped her. A narrow wooden tower stood above a forested Idaho ridge, its enclosed room surrounded by windows. Abandoned fire lookout, sold as is. The description was almost aggressively discouraging. Remote access, deteriorated road, no active electrical service, water unavailable on site, maintenance required, minimum bid $100. Claire stared at the number. $100 would not buy a week in most motels. Apparently it could buy a tower nobody wanted. She attended the auction 2 days later, mostly to prove to herself there had to be a catch. There were plenty. The county representative warned that the lookout was no longer maintained for fire operations. Access conditions could change. Winter would be severe. Wildfire season created additional hazards. Claire asked whether someone could legally stay there. Once transferred, use is subject to the property terms listed in the packet. "But the structure is mine. If your bid is accepted." A man nearby laughed. "Kid, you'd be buying a staircase to nowhere." Several people smiled. Claire felt the familiar heat of embarrassment, but she kept reading. She had recently learned that respectable-looking houses could hide debts large enough to throw you into a car. At least this place advertised its problems. When the lookout came up for bidding, Claire raised her hand. 100? Silence. The auctioneer asked for another bid. Nobody offered one. A minute later, the lookout was hers. Claire paid the $100 and received a packet thick with warnings and property information. Sitting in her SUV afterward, she examined the transfer sheet while Ranger watched her from the passenger seat. Near the bottom was an older designation, Dawson Ridge Lookout. Claire frowned. Dawson. Ranger's ears moved. Probably half the state has something named Dawson. She folded the paper away. The coincidence was strange. Nothing more. By late afternoon, Claire was driving deeper into Idaho wilderness. Pavement became gravel. Gravel became a rough mountain road, and the SUV climbed slowly through pine forest. Smoke from a distant wildfire softened the horizon into a gray-orange haze. The fire was far enough away that Claire told herself not to think about it. The road demanded enough attention. Twice she stopped to move fallen branches. Once she considered turning around when the tires slipped on loose stone. But there was nowhere meaningful to turn around to. Near sunset, the lookout finally appeared above the trees. The tower was taller than the auction photograph suggested. Weathered stairs climbed toward a square room wrapped in dusty windows. Several panes were cracked. One section of railing leaned outward. Claire parked and stared upward. $100, she murmured. Ranger jumped out first. Claire climbed behind him, testing each step. At the top, she forced the swollen door open. Dust covered the floor. Wind whispered through damaged window frames. There was no furniture except a battered cabinet and a narrow shelf. Yet the view stretched for miles across dark green ridges. Claire set down her backpack. For the first time since leaving the house, she was standing somewhere she could call hers. Ranger sniffed along the walls. Suddenly he stopped near one corner, his nose pressed against the floor. "What is it?" He scratched once. Claire ignored him and turned toward the windows. Ranger scratched again, harder. "Ranger, stop." He did not. His claws worked furiously against one weathered plank. Claire crossed the room and caught his collar. The board beneath his paws shifted. She froze. Unlike the others, one end sat slightly raised from the floor. Ranger pulled free, shoved his nose against the narrow gap, and began scratching again. This time, the loose floorboard lifted just enough for Claire to see darkness underneath. Claire kept one hand on Ranger's collar and crouched beside the raised floorboard. The gap beneath it was too narrow to see anything except darkness. She pressed the plank with her fingers. It shifted, then settled back with a dry creak. "You're going to tear the whole place apart before we spent one night here," she told Ranger. He answered by pushing his nose toward the gap again. Claire pulled him away. Whatever was beneath the floor could wait until daylight. She had more immediate problems. The lookout had survived years of Idaho weather, but surviving was not the same as being comfortable. 2 windows were cracked badly enough to let cold air through. Another pane had a missing corner. The door only closed if Claire lifted it slightly before pushing. There was no electricity when she tried the old switches, and the faucet attached to a tiny counter produced nothing. She had brought several gallons of water in the SUV, but hauling them up the tower stairs made her reconsider every unnecessary trip. By the time she carried her bedding, food, Ranger's supplies, and 2 water containers to the top, darkness had settled across the ridge. Claire ate crackers and canned tuna while Ranger finished his food beside her. Far beyond the windows, a faint orange-gray haze blurred part of the horizon. Wildfire smoke. The county packet had mentioned active fires in the region, but none were currently close enough to place the lookout under evacuation orders. Claire still watched the haze longer than she intended. "One disaster at a time," she murmured. Ranger lay beside her sleeping bag. The night was colder than the valley. Wind pressed against the windows, making loose frames rattle. Claire slept badly, waking several times convinced someone was climbing the stairs. Each time there was only Ranger breathing beside her and forest darkness beyond the glass. Morning made the place look less threatening and more neglected. Dust covered the corners. Insects had collected along the window tracks. The old cabinet smelled of mice. Claire spent an hour sweeping and covering the worst broken pane with plastic from her SUV. Ranger followed her until he remembered the loose board. Scratch, scratch, scratch. No. Claire pointed toward the other side of the room. Ranger reluctantly moved away. She was fastening plastic over another crack when an engine sounded below. Claire froze. A pickup had stopped near her SUV. A young man stepped out wearing work clothes and looked up at the tower. Claire went down with Ranger close behind. "Can I help you?" she called. The man turned. He looked about 24, with dusty boots and a faded work shirt. "Was about to ask you the same thing." "Why?" "Because this lookout's been empty for years." "Not anymore." He glanced at her SUV, then back at the tower. "You camping?" "I own it." His expression made Claire immediately defensive. "Seriously, county auction." "They actually sold this place?" "For $100. He looked up at the weathered tower. "That explains the price." Claire folded her arms. "Everybody's a comedian." "Ben Harper." He gestured toward the road. "Seasonal trail and maintenance work. I was checking access farther up and saw the vehicle, Claire Dawson." Ben's eyes moved briefly toward the lookout. "Dawson." "Yes." Like the ridge, Claire felt the same small discomfort she had when reading the paperwork. Apparently, Ben did not pursue it. Instead, he looked toward the hazy horizon. "You planning to stay up here? That's generally what people do with houses." "That isn't a house." "It has walls and a roof." "It's a fire lookout on a mountain during wildfire season." Claire's jaw tightened. "I read the paperwork." "Then you read that there's one practical road down." "I drove it." "Driving it in clear weather isn't the problem." Ben pointed toward the distant smoke. "If fire changes direction and they restrict access, you don't wait around deciding what to pack. You leave when they tell you." Claire looked toward the ridge. "Is the fire coming here?" "Not right now." "Then right now." I have somewhere to sleep." Something in her tone stopped him. Ben looked at Ranger, then at the belongings visible through the SUV window. "All right," he said. "Just keep enough fuel to get down, and keep water in the vehicle. Not all of it upstairs." That was useful enough that Claire's irritation eased slightly. "Anything else?" "Don't trust that railing." "Already figured that out." "Then you're learning." He returned to his truck. Before leaving, he lowered the window. "Smoke gets heavier. Check alerts before you convince yourself it's nothing." Claire watched him drive away. "Friendly neighborhood optimist," she told Ranger. "Back upstairs." She moved one water jug back to the SUV as Ben suggested. The practical reality of the lookout settled around her through the afternoon. Every gallon had to be carried. Every broken window meant another cold night. Her phone signal appeared and vanished depending on where she stood. Yet none of those problems came with a foreclosure deadline. The tower was damaged, but its problems were visible. Claire found that strangely comforting. Ranger returned to the loose board before sunset. This time he scratched hard enough to catch a claw under its raised edge. The plank lifted and dropped with a knock. "Fine," Claire said. "You win." She had found a small pry bar among her tools in the SUV. She slid its end beneath the board and applied pressure. The plank resisted. She shifted position and tried again. With a sharp crack, one end rose several inches. Dust rolled from the gap. Ranger immediately shoved his nose toward it. "Back." Claire moved him aside and lifted the board farther. Beneath the floor was a shallow cavity between structural supports. She expected mouse nesting. There was some old shredded material tucked near one corner, probably what Ranger had smelled, but behind it sat something else. A rectangular metal box. Claire stared at it. The box was dark with rust and dust, wedged tightly beneath the floor. She reached down and pulled. It resisted until she cleared debris from one side, then came free with a scrape. It was heavier than an empty box, but not heavy enough to suggest anything dramatic. Ranger sniffed every edge. "This is what you destroyed my floor for?" Claire carried it to the windows where the remaining daylight was stronger. There was no visible lock. A simple metal latch had corroded almost shut before opening it. Claire brushed dust from the lid. Faint markings appeared underneath. She wiped again. 2 characters emerged first. S.D. Claire rubbed harder until the rest became legible. S. Dawson. She stopped. Dawson Ranger sat beside her. Claire thought of the property sheet downstairs in the SUV. Dawson Ridge Lookout. Her own surname, now another Dawson, apparently connected closely enough to the tower to hide a box beneath its floor. Her father had never mentioned this place. He had barely spoken about extended family at all. Claire forced the latch with the pry bar. It snapped open. Inside were bundles of old papers, photographs, folded maps, and envelopes tied together with faded string. No money, no explanation. Claire lifted the top sheet carefully. It was ruled into columns filled with handwritten times, temperatures, wind directions, visibility notes, and observations of smoke. At the top were the words, "Fire Observation Log." Claire turned the page toward the fading light. At the bottom, beneath the final entry, someone had signed a name in dark ink. She read it once, then whispered it aloud. "Samuel Dawson." Claire read the signature again. Samuel Dawson. The name meant nothing to her, and that bothered her more than if she had recognized it. She sat cross-legged on the lookout floor with the metal box open between her knees while Ranger sniffed the old papers. "Careful," she told him, moving his nose away from a brittle envelope. The box contained more than she had first realized. Beneath the fire observation log were additional handwritten logs, some organized by date and others filled with weather notes. wind direction, visibility, smoke columns, and short descriptions of conditions across the surrounding ridges. Several folded maps had pencil lines drawn across them. A bundle of letters was tied with faded string. Claire resisted opening those immediately. Instead, she picked up the photographs. The first showed 3 men beside a truck. The second showed a forest road she did not recognize. The third made her stop. A younger man stood on the stairs of the very lookout Claire was sitting inside. He was lean, dark-haired, and squinting into the sun. On the back, written in faded ink, were 2 words: Samuel, lookout. Claire carried the photograph to the window and compared the structure behind him with the room around her. Same railing design, same window spacing. Even the cabinet visible through the open door appeared to be the battered cabinet still standing against the wall. "So you worked here," she whispered. Ranger rested his chin on her leg. Claire searched the remaining photographs for Michael. She found no one she recognized. Her father had rarely talked about his childhood. When Claire asked about grandparents, he usually said they were gone and changed the subject. She had assumed there was simply nothing worth telling. Now a man with her surname was staring back at her from a photograph taken at a lookout, also bearing her surname. By morning, Claire had slept even less than the previous night. Wind rattled the patched windows, and every time she woke, she saw the metal box on the floor. After breakfast, she began sorting its contents into careful stacks. One set of logs looked official enough that she wondered whether they should have been in an archive rather than beneath a floorboard. Ben's truck appeared near midday. He climbed the tower, carrying a small roll of weatherproof tape. Figured that broken pane would annoy you before you admitted you needed something better than plastic. I was doing fine. Of course. He noticed the loose floorboard. What happened? Ranger wagged his tail. Claire pointed at him. Archaeology. Ben crouched beside the opening, then looked at the metal box. That was under there. Apparently Ranger has career options. Claire handed him one of the logs. Does this look real to you? Ben read several lines. I'm not an archivist. Helpful, but yes. Old lookout logs were basically observation records: weather, smoke, location, visibility. This looks like that kind of thing. He turned to the signature. Samuel Dawson. Ever heard the name? Ben shook his head. No. This place is called Dawson Ridge. He worked here. My name is Dawson. Could still be coincidence. 3 coincidences. Then maybe not. Claire showed him the photograph. Ben studied it, then glanced around the room. Definitely this tower. My father never mentioned anyone named Samuel. Ben returned the photograph. Maybe someone in town knows. Claire looked at the box. The thought of carrying fragile papers down the mountain made her nervous, but sitting alone and guessing would answer nothing. She selected the photograph. 2 logs and 1 map, placed them carefully inside a folder, and left the rest secured in the box. Ranger came with her. Ben followed in his truck as far as the main road before turning toward his work route. In town, Claire asked at a small public records office whether anyone knew about historical fire lookout records. The clerk directed her to Eleanor Price, a retired wildfire dispatcher who still volunteered several afternoons each week helping organize local fire history material. Eleanor was 71, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. She listened without interrupting, while Claire explained where the papers had been found. Then Claire placed the first log on the table. Eleanor's expression changed. Where exactly did you say this was? Under a floorboard in Dawson Ridge Lookout. Eleanor pulled the paper closer without touching it. May I? Sure. She read the date, then the entries. This format is right for the period. Do you know Samuel Dawson? Eleanor looked at the signature for several seconds. I know the name. Claire's pulse quickened. Who was he? A lookout? among other seasonal firework. He spent time on that ridge. Why were his records hidden under the floor? That I can't tell you. Eleanor examined the photograph next. Recognition showed immediately. Yes, that's Samuel. Claire sat opposite her. Was the ridge named after him? The name was associated with the Dawson family in the area. Samuel certainly became associated with the lookout. Claire unfolded the hand-drawn map. Pencil marks crossed several roads and ridges. Eleanor studied it but did not speculate. Some of these are old access routes, she said. A few probably don't exist in usable form anymore. The logs belong in an archive. Don't they? Claire asked. Some official records would normally have been retained through agency channels. Personal notes and copies could stay with the lookout or the individual. We'd need to compare these before deciding what they are. Claire appreciated the caution, even though it frustrated her. Every answer seemed to arrive wrapped in another question. Eleanor turned to a different log. Where did you grow up? Mostly outside Idaho. Your family left the area, I guess? My father never talked about it. Eleanor looked up. What was your father's name? Michael Dawson. The room went very still. Eleanor removed her glasses. Michael. Claire felt the hairs rise along her arms. You knew him? Not well. I knew of him when he was young. Then you know why he never told me about Samuel? I wouldn't claim that. Eleanor's gaze returned to the photograph. Families can become complicated around people who are remembered strongly. Claire leaned forward. What does that mean? It means I don't want to turn guesses into facts. Claire hated how familiar that sounded. Her father had spent years avoiding details. Now the first person who recognized Samuel was choosing every word carefully. Was Samuel related to Michael? Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood and crossed to a cabinet filled with binders. She pulled down an old index and searched several pages. Samuel Dawson had a family, she said. I remember that much. But memory isn't enough. Her finger stopped on an entry. She read it, then looked at Claire. What Claire asked? Eleanor turned the binder around. The entry listed Samuel Dawson alongside basic historical information. Beneath his name was a family reference. One son, Michael Dawson. Claire stared at it. No, Claire. My father never said his father worked in a lookout. He never even told me his name. Eleanor sat across from her again. I can't tell you why Michael kept silent, but this part isn't speculation. She placed Samuel's old photograph beside Claire's folder of documents. Samuel Dawson wasn't just the man who worked that lookout. Claire looked from the photograph to the record bearing Michael's name. Eleanor held her gaze. Claire, he was your grandfather. Claire drove back toward Dawson Ridge with anger sitting heavier in her chest than the folder on the passenger seat. Ranger occupied the back because Samuel's photograph, the copied family record, and 2 fire logs were spread beside her as though paper could explain 20 years of silence. Her grandfather, Michael's father. Claire tried to remember every conversation in which she had asked about family. There had never been many. Michael usually answered with a sentence or two and changed the subject. His parents were gone. Idaho was somewhere he used to live. There was nothing there for them anymore. Claire had accepted those answers because children eventually learned which doors their parents preferred closed. Now she owned one of those doors for $100. She reached the lookout near evening. Smoke had thickened since morning, turning the distant ridges pale gray. Claire climbed the stairs, opened the hidden box, and set Samuel's photograph beside a photograph of Michael she kept in her wallet. She searched their faces for resemblance. There was some around the eyes, perhaps, or maybe she wanted to see it. You could have told me his name, she said to Michael's photograph, Ranger watched from beside the loose floorboard. "You could have told me anything." Her anger sharpened when she remembered the foreclosure notice. Michael had hidden the debt until death made it Claire's problem. Now she knew he had hidden an entire family history, too. She opened Samuel's fire logs because reading was easier than imagining reasons. Most entries were ordinary temperatures: wind, visibility, smoke reports. Then one sequence stood apart. The pages covered several days during a major wildfire decades earlier. Samuel's handwriting became tighter as conditions worsened. Wind direction appeared repeatedly. So did references to a south road, a settlement below the ridge, and an old logging route. On a hand-drawn map, Samuel had marked both roads. Claire traced the pencil lines. The south road looked like the obvious route out. The logging road curved north through rougher terrain. Beside it, Samuel had written several times in arrows. She understood none of it. The next morning, Ben arrived while Claire was carrying water up the stairs. He took one container without asking. "Smoke's worse. Good morning to you, too." "I'm serious." "So am I. I can see it. At the top." Ben set the water down and noticed the papers covering the table. "You learn anything about Samuel?" Claire handed him the family record. "He was my grandfather." Ben read it. "Your dad never told you?" "Not once." "That's strange. My father specialized in not telling me things." Ben looked at her. Claire immediately knew what he was about to ask and answered first. "The debt. He never told me about that either. I thought the house was safe. Then he died. And 18 days later, I got a foreclosure notice explaining that apparently I didn't know anything about our finances." "Claire, don't tell me he probably had reasons." "I wasn't going to—" That stopped her. Ben looked toward the old photograph. "I was going to say, finding out more things he hid probably doesn't feel great." Claire let out a breath. "No, it doesn't." She showed him Samuel's map. "Can you make sense of this?" Ben studied it. His finger followed the southern route. "This looks like an old road alignment, and this northern line could be logging access." Samuel kept recording wind direction beside both. During a fire, roads matter. Obviously. Not just for evacuation, crew movement, equipment, escape routes. If wind pushes fire across one road, everything changes. Claire turned to the dated logs. Samuel had recorded wind shifting from west to southwest, then strengthening. Later entries mentioned the south road repeatedly. The old logging route appeared more often as the fire developed. "He was watching something happen," she said. "That was his job. But why keep these particular logs under the floor?" Ben shook his head. "That part I can't answer." Claire's phone vibrated against the table. An automated wildfire update loaded slowly through the weak signal. The active fire she had been watching had expanded overnight. The lookout remained outside any evacuation zone. But smoke conditions were expected to worsen. Ben read the update over her shoulder. "You need an evacuation bag ready. I already have most of my belongings in boxes. That isn't the same thing. Documents, water, dog food, clothes, medication if you take any. Things you can grab in 2 minutes." Claire disliked the idea because it felt too much like packing the SUV after foreclosure. The fire isn't here. Correct. Prepare while it isn't. She wanted to argue, but his logic was impossible to dismiss. Together they moved extra water back into the SUV and made sure Claire had enough fuel to reach town. Ben checked the access road before leaving. "If you get an evacuation order, don't wait for me to come tell you." "I know, Claire. I said I know." After he left, she watched smoke drift across the horizon. The lookout suddenly felt less like a permanent refuge and more like what it had originally been built to be, a place from which someone watched danger approach. That afternoon, Claire returned to town with several of Samuel's logs and maps. Eleanor had already begun searching historical fire material. She placed an archived chronology on the table. The dates in Samuel's logs correspond to a significant wildfire. Claire sat beside her. What happened? The fire expanded quickly after a wind change. Crews were stretched. There was an evacuation from a small community below this ridge. Claire unfolded Samuel's map. He kept marking the South Road. Eleanor compared the dates. That would have been the primary route people expected to use. And this Claire pointed to the logging road. Eleanor frowned. Older access. It existed then? Samuel was tracking it. Eleanor read several entries. Yes. Why? We need more than notes before deciding. Claire leaned back. You say that a lot, because history becomes fiction very quickly when people fill gaps with what they hope happened. Claire could not argue with that. Eleanor searched additional records while Claire read through the official chronology. It described fire behavior, crew assignments, equipment movements, and the evacuation. According to the report, residents had been moved out successfully before conditions deteriorated further. Claire scanned for Samuel's name. Nothing. She read another page. Nothing. Where is he? Eleanor looked over. Who? Samuel. Claire turned pages faster. He was sitting in that lookout recording the fire. His logs cover these exact dates. Eleanor checked the index, then searched another section. Eventually, she found one brief reference to observation information originating from Dawson Ridge. Samuel's name was barely attached to it. Claire stared at the official report. That's it. Official reports focus on operations. But he was there. Yes. Then why hide the logs? Why mark the roads? Why did my father never tell me about him? Eleanor did not answer. Outside, smoke had turned the afternoon sun dull orange. Claire looked again at Samuel's handwritten notes, then at the clean official summary stating that the evacuation had succeeded. Somewhere between those two records was a story she still could not see. The community had escaped the wildfire. The roads in Samuel's private logs had clearly mattered. Yet in the official account of that night, Samuel Dawson, the man watching it all from the mountain, was almost entirely absent. Claire spent the next morning wondering whether she had been looking for a hero because she needed one. The official report bothered her precisely because it was so ordinary. Fire expanded, evacuation succeeded, crews repositioned. No dramatic mention of Samuel Dawson. No paragraph explaining why his private logs had tracked wind shifts and alternate roads so carefully. If he had done something extraordinary, why had nobody recorded it? She carried the hidden box to the table and sorted its contents again, this time trying not to assume anything. Ranger lay near the loose floorboard, watching her turn pages. The old fire logs were detailed but restrained. Samuel wrote like someone doing a job, not someone building a legend. Times, wind, visibility, smoke direction, road conditions. One hand-drawn map stood out because the pencil marks were darker than on the others. The main road running south from the community below the ridge had been circled twice. North of it, Samuel had drawn a rough line through timber and labeled it Old Logging Road. Beside that line, in block letters, he had written, "Safe if South Road closes." Claire read the words several times. That sounds pretty specific. Ranger thumped his tail. She photographed the map, then drove down to meet Ben where he was working near a trail junction. He leaned against his truck while studying the image on her phone. Can you tell where this logging road was? Maybe. That's your favorite word. It's a responsible word. He enlarged the photograph. This ridgeline still exists. Obviously. Creek should be here, if the map is accurate. The old road would split north before dropping into the valley. Does it still exist? Parts of old logging roads last forever. Usable is another question. Can we find it? Ben looked toward the smoky sky. We can find where it used to start. We are not going wandering miles through dry timber because your grandfather drew a line 80 years ago. Fine. You said that too quickly. They drove separately toward an older access area below Dawson Ridge. Claire left Ranger leashed because the terrain was rough and dry. Ben followed the contours from Samuel's map rather than trying to match trees or other features that had changed. After half an hour, he stopped near a depression almost swallowed by brush. There. Claire saw nothing at first. Then she noticed the unnatural flatness beneath the weeds. 2 shallow tire grooves remained in the earth, nearly erased by decades of growth. That's a road. Used to be. Ben walked a short distance along it. Saplings grew through the center. Fallen limbs blocked parts of the grade. You couldn't just send normal traffic through here now. Claire held up the map. But back then, depends on maintenance. If Samuel marked it as an alternate route, he probably knew its condition. She looked south toward the modern road disappearing between trees. If the south road closed, this was the other way out. Possibly. There's that word again. Ben smiled. You want certainty from a pencil map. I want to know why he cared about this road. Then you need someone who remembers what people called it. They did not have to wait long. On their way back, they encountered a pickup stopped near a cattle gate along the lower access road. A man in his mid-50s was repairing a chain. He looked up as Claire and Ben approached. Ben knew him. Ray Coulter. Ray nodded at Ben, then studied Claire. You're the one living in the old lookout. Claire immediately recognized the tone people used when they thought she had made a mistake. I bought it. Heard that too. For $100, if you want the full joke. Ray did not laugh. I think anyone staying up there this time of year should have a better evacuation plan than $100. Claire glanced toward the smoke. The fire isn't on this ridge, not yet. Ben stepped in before Claire could answer sharply. We're looking at an old logging road, historical stuff. Ray followed Ben's gesture toward the brush-covered grade. That one. Claire showed him Samuel's map. Do you recognize it? Ray took the phone and squinted at the image. His expression changed when he read the labels. Where'd you get this? From the lookout. Old records. My grandfather's. Ray looked at her. Who was your grandfather? Samuel Dawson. For the first time, Ray seemed interested in more than her safety choices. He returned the phone slowly. My father used to call that track Dawson Cutoff. Claire's heartbeat quickened. Why? Don't know the whole story. What do you know? Ray leaned against the gate. Just things I heard when I was a kid. There was a bad fire before my time. People had to get out fast. My father said some families went north through that old logging road. Claire looked at Ben. Because the south road closed. Ray shrugged. Could have been. He only ever said people got out that way once. Did he mention Samuel? Not by name, at least not that I remember. But Dawson Cutoff wasn't an official road name. Claire stared back at the overgrown grade. The map, Samuel's warning, and Ray's childhood memory were beginning to overlap. Not proof, but more than coincidence. Ray crossed his arms. You're staying in that tower with smoke thickening every day? For now, bad idea. Claire's irritation returned. I've heard, then hear it again, that access road can become a trap if conditions change. I check alerts. Alerts don't make roads safer. Ben glanced at Claire. He's not wrong. She looked between them. I'm not refusing evacuation. I'm refusing homelessness. Ray's expression softened slightly but did not change his answer. Fire doesn't care why you stayed. That sentence followed Claire all the way back up the mountain. By late afternoon, smoke had noticeably thickened. It lay across the distant ridges in layers, flattening the horizon. Claire checked her phone twice. The wildfire had expanded again, though no evacuation order covered Dawson Ridge. She topped off the SUV with supplies anyway, remembering Ben's warning: water, dog food, documents, fuel. If she had to leave, she would not waste time. Back inside the lookout, Claire returned to the hidden box. The map had answered one question partially. The old logging road had existed, and someone else remembered people using it during a fire. But the official report still made Samuel look like a minor observer. Claire wondered whether that was the truth. Maybe her grandfather had simply drawn a useful route and done nothing more. Maybe the rest of the story existed only in her need for family history to mean something better than debt and silence. Ranger moved closer as Claire lifted the bundle of letters from the box. Until now, she had avoided them because they felt more private than logs. The string around them was brittle, and she worked it loose carefully. Most envelopes were yellowed with age. Several had names she did not recognize. One envelope was thicker than the others and had no postage. The handwriting across the front was different from Samuel's. Claire turned it toward the window. 4 words were written clearly across the envelope. To Samuel, from the families who made it out. Claire stopped breathing for a moment. Outside, smoke drifted across the Idaho ridges. Inside, the lookout. She held the first piece of evidence that suggested the missing part of Samuel Dawson's story had been remembered by the people who survived it. Claire held the envelope for nearly a minute before opening it. The paper had softened with age, and the flap separated with almost no resistance. Inside were several folded letters, each written by a different hand. Ranger lay beside the table while Claire unfolded the first one. The writer thanked Samuel for warning their family before the South Road became dangerous. Another letter described loading children into a truck while smoke turned the afternoon dark. A third mentioned hearing that the fire had shifted and realizing too late that the route they planned to use was no longer safe. Claire read each letter twice. They were not dramatic. Nobody called Samuel a hero. Nobody wrote that he fought the fire alone. The gratitude was more specific than that. Thank you for telling us to go north. Thank you for coming down when the radio wasn't getting through. Thank you for making us leave before we thought we had to. One sentence stopped Claire completely. If you hadn't come down from that tower, we wouldn't have known. She leaned back in the chair. Come down? Ranger lifted his head. Claire spread the letters across the table and searched for anything else that explained it. Until now, she had assumed Samuel remained in the lookout, watching the fire and reporting what he saw. That was what a lookout did. But multiple letters referred to seeing him below the ridge, speaking directly to residents, or carrying warnings from the tower. Claire picked up the fire logs again and compared dates. The entries became shorter as the fire intensified. Wind direction changed, visibility dropped. The South Road appeared repeatedly. Then there was a gap. She had noticed it before, but thought nothing of it. Nearly 2 hours passed between entries. When Samuel resumed writing, his notes were even more abbreviated. Claire's pulse quickened. She photographed the letters and drove down to town the next morning. Smoke had grown thick enough that distant hills disappeared entirely. Ash had not reached the lookout, but the sky carried a dull yellow cast. Claire checked emergency alerts before starting the SUV. The fire remained outside her immediate evacuation zone, though several roads farther south were under restrictions. She brought Ranger with her and packed more water than necessary. Eleanor was already waiting when Claire entered the records room. You sounded different on the phone, she said. Claire placed the letters on the table. Read this one. Eleanor put on her glasses and read silently. Her face tightened. Where was this in the box bundled with the others? And you hadn't opened them? Not until yesterday. Eleanor read another letter, then another. These are important, because they say he came down from the lookout, Yes, that wasn't in the official report. Not clearly. Claire folded her arms. Then the report missed what he actually did. Maybe. But we need to understand the sequence before saying that. Claire exhaled. You always make everything sound less exciting. That's the job. Eleanor pulled the archived chronology closer. Look, the fire was moving unevenly that afternoon. Dispatch records show communication problems in several locations. Radio failure, partial failures, congestion, weak reception. Different systems not always reaching each other cleanly. We need to be precise. Claire pointed to the letter. Someone wrote that the radio wasn't getting through. That supports a communication problem from the resident's point of view. It does not tell us exactly what failed technically. Claire sat down. Fine. What can we prove? Eleanor began comparing times from Samuel's logs with the official chronology. A wind shift occurred shortly before the South Road was later restricted. Fire crews repositioned. A dispatch note referenced difficulty confirming conditions near the ridge. Another entry documented efforts to move residents away from the southern route. Samuel's name still appeared only indirectly. There, Claire said. That's when he left. Eleanor looked at the timeline. Possibly, the letters say he came down. Yes, that part is stronger now. Then why didn't anybody write it properly? Eleanor looked at her over the rim of her glasses. Official incident records are not biographies. They focus on command decisions, resource movement, suppression activity, and outcomes. A lookout leaving his post to warn residents might be mentioned in a narrative account, but it could also disappear into broader language if the evacuation was recorded as a collective operation. Claire looked at Samuel's photograph. So he could do something important and still become a footnote. Easily. The answer irritated her, but not because Eleanor was wrong. Claire had spent years assuming history was what survived in official records. Now she saw how much depended on which records survived and who bothered to read them together. The hidden box mattered because Samuel had kept what the formal summary did not. Ben arrived near midday, carrying sandwiches and a printed wildfire update. You two planning to live in this room? He asked. Depends, Claire said. Does this building have running water? Luxury standards rising already? He handed her the update. The fire had expanded again. No evacuation order for Dawson Ridge yet, but the containment lines remained unstable in several sectors. Ben's tone became serious. You should keep the SUV pointed downhill and ready. It already is. Good. Claire showed him the letters. Ben read the sentence about Samuel coming down from the tower. So he left during the fire. Looks that way. That would be risky. Maybe people needed warning. Maybe. Ben looked at Eleanor, apparently realizing where Claire had learned to use the word. I'm surrounded. Eleanor smiled faintly. Evidence first. They spent another hour matching letter details to maps. One family mentioned the North Logging Road. Another described turning away from the south route after Samuel warned that conditions had changed. A third thanked him for insisting they not wait for official confirmation before moving toward the alternate road. Claire circled those lines. That sounds like he knew the south road would close. Eleanor nodded. It suggests he believed that strongly. And he was right. According to the later chronology, yes. Fire reached the vicinity of that route not long afterward. Claire thought about Samuel alone in the tower, watching the smoke column and wind direction shift while communications became unreliable. He saw it before they did. That's what lookouts were trained to do. Ben said, see changes early. But he left the tower. Eleanor gathered the letters carefully. That is the part we still need to reconstruct. Claire returned to Dawson Ridge late in the afternoon. The smoke was heavier now, and the sun looked like a dim red coin behind it. Ranger paced the lookout while Claire reopened the hidden box. She searched for any log pages she might have overlooked, focusing on the final entries from the old wildfire. One sheet was folded beneath a map. It contained only a few lines. The handwriting was hurried, darker in places where the pencil had pressed hard. Claire read the first entry. Wind shifting. South Road exposed. The next line gave a time. Then radio traffic weak. No confirmation. She moved to the final sentence. 4 short fragments, written without the careful formatting of the earlier logs. Claire felt her throat tighten as she read them aloud. Radio failed. Road will close. Going down. Ranger stood beside her. Claire looked through the lookout windows toward the smoke-covered Idaho ridges and finally understood the question the letters had been asking all along. Samuel Dawson had not stayed safely in the tower and watched the evacuation happen below. At the moment he believed the warning could no longer wait. He had left the lookout and gone down into the fire zone himself. Claire took the final fire log back to Eleanor the next morning. Smoke hung lower over the valley, turning the daylight gray and flat, and emergency signs had begun appearing along the road into town. Ranger rode with his head between the front seats, while Claire kept the hidden box secured on the floor behind her. The words from Samuel's last entry had stayed with her all night. Radio failed. Road will close. Going down. Eleanor read the page slowly, then placed it beside the letters. "This changes the timeline," she said. "How? Before we knew he warned people, now we know he believed the South Road was about to become unusable before he left the tower." Claire pointed to the time written beside the entry. "Can we prove when the road actually became dangerous?" Eleanor pulled the archived fire chronology closer. They compared Samuel's timestamp with dispatch notes and later road restrictions. The south route had remained technically open for a short period after Samuel left the lookout, but fire activity had intensified rapidly along the corridor. "So he saw it coming," Claire said. "That appears to be what happened. And the radio wasn't working. At least not reliably enough for him to trust the warning was getting through." Eleanor tapped one of the family letters. "These people remembered him arriving in person. That supports the log." Claire leaned back. The story was no longer a vague family legend. Samuel had been in the lookout, had seen the wildfire shift, had believed the main evacuation road was going to fail, and had gone down when communication could not be trusted. But one part remained unclear. What did he actually do after he left? That's what we still need to establish. Eleanor had already gathered more records. One dispatch references mentioned residents being redirected north. Another noted fire crews moving to protect an alternate evacuation corridor. Neither named Samuel. Claire traced the timing with her finger. "This starts right after he left. Yes, that can't be nothing." "It isn't nothing," Eleanor said, "but we still need a human account tying him to the route." As if the sentence had summoned one, Ray Coulter appeared at the records office less than an hour later. He carried a flattened cardboard folder under one arm. "Ben said you were looking for old accounts," he said. Claire stood. "You found something?" "Maybe." Ray placed the folder on the table and pulled out several photocopied pages. "My father wrote this for a local history group years ago. Never published, far as I know." Eleanor put on her glasses. The account described the old wildfire from the perspective of Ray's father, who had been a young man at the time. Claire read over Eleanor's shoulder. Smoke had already darkened the valley. Families were preparing to leave by the south road. Then Samuel Dawson arrived from the ridge and warned that the fire had shifted and the south route might be cut before everyone cleared it. "He actually names Samuel," Claire said. Ray nodded. "That's why I brought it." The next paragraph described Samuel directing vehicles toward the old logging route to the north. He knew the road because he had watched logging crews use it and had marked where it rejoined safer ground. Some residents hesitated because the road was rough and unofficial. Samuel insisted that waiting for confirmation could cost them the window they had left. Claire felt a chill despite the warm room. "Did your father go that way?" "Yes." Ray pointed to a later paragraph. He wrote that Samuel stayed at the junction until several families had turned north. Claire continued reading. Fire crews then reached the corridor and took over traffic control while protecting the escape route from approaching fire. Samuel did not lead a heroic convoy through flames. He did not fight the wildfire by himself. He recognized the danger early, brought the warning down, and got people moving toward the alternate road before the south route deteriorated. "This is what the letters were talking about," Claire said. Eleanor nodded. "And it matches the operational records." Crews later held the northern corridor long enough for the evacuation to finish. Ray looked at Samuel's photograph on the table. "My father never called him a hero. He just said Dawson saw what was happening before the rest of them did." Claire swallowed. "That sounds like enough." They spent the next hour reconstructing the sequence carefully. Samuel observed the wind shift. Smoke behavior changed. The south road became increasingly exposed. Radio communication was unreliable. He left the lookout. He warned residents directly. He pointed them toward the old logging road. Residents began moving north. Fire crews arrived and protected the corridor while evacuation continued. Later, the south road became unsafe enough to validate Samuel's prediction. Claire looked at the official report again. It still reduced the event to operational language. Evacuation redirected, alternate route used, crews secured corridor. Samuel's role existed in the gaps between those sentences. He never wrote what he did afterward. Claire said. Eleanor reached for the final pages of the recovered logs. "There may be one more entry." Claire had read the last page repeatedly, but Eleanor turned it over. On the back, almost hidden by age discoloration, was a short line written later in steadier handwriting. "Family's clear. Crews have the road." That was all. No description of fear, no claim that he saved anyone, no complaint that the official report barely mentioned him. Just confirmation that the families were out and the crews had control. Claire stared at the sentence until the words blurred slightly. That's it. For him. Maybe that was the important part, Eleanor said. Ray gathered his father's account. Sounds like the old man I heard about. Claire looked at him. You heard about Samuel? Not much, just that he was serious about the ridge and fire weather. My father trusted him. That mattered more to Claire than she expected. Samuel was becoming real through other people's memories, not polished into a legend, but made human by small details, careful notes, stubborn warnings, a road he refused to ignore. Her phone buzzed sharply on the table. All three of them looked down. Emergency alert. Claire opened it. The active wildfire had changed direction overnight. New winds were pushing fire toward the broader ridge system surrounding Dawson Ridge. The alert did not yet order Claire to evacuate, but it upgraded the area to a higher readiness level and warned that access conditions could change quickly. Ben called seconds later. You saw it? I'm looking at it. I'm heading toward the ridge to check the road. You need your vehicle packed? It already is. Everything important. Claire looked at the hidden box. Almost. Don't wait until smoke is on the road. His voice was firmer than usual. If they issue the order, you leave. I know. She ended the call and looked through the records office window. Smoke had thickened since she arrived. The sky was no longer gray. It carried a dull amber tint. Eleanor noticed where Claire was looking. History doesn't obligate you to repeat it. Claire nodded. I'm not planning to. Ray gathered his papers. Good. Claire drove back toward the lookout with Ranger beside her and Samuel's box secured in the SUV. As the road climbed, the smoke became denser. Ash had not begun to fall, but the smell of burning timber was stronger than before. At the tower, Ben's truck was already parked below. He stood beside the access road with his phone in one hand. Claire stepped out. How bad? Not immediate, but worse. He showed her the latest map. The fire had advanced enough that the main road down from Dawson Ridge now sat inside a potential closure area if winds continued shifting. Claire looked from the map to the road she had driven every day since buying the lookout. They could close this, yes. When depends on fire behavior, Ranger pressed against Claire's leg. She looked up at the tower, then toward the smoke-darkened ridge beyond it. Decades earlier, Samuel had watched a road become dangerous and understood what that meant before the people below did. Now Claire stood on the same mountain with a warning of her own. Her phone buzzed again. Prepare to evacuate. Access road may close with little notice. Claire did not wait for the alert to become more dramatic. The words, prepare to evacuate, remained on her phone while Ben stood beside the road, watching smoke move across the ridge. I'm packing now, she said. Good. You sound surprised. I've met you. Fair. Ranger followed Claire up the tower stairs, staying close instead of racing ahead. Inside, the lookout felt different. Nothing had physically changed, but every object suddenly became a decision. Bedding, food, water, clothes, tools, the battered cabinet, the patched windows, the few things she had begun arranging as though she might actually stay. Claire stood in the middle of the room and felt the same panic she had felt on the last morning in Michael's house, when every possession had seemed to ask whether it deserved space in the SUV. She forced herself to stop. This was not foreclosure. Nobody was giving her 30 minutes to remove her life. Fire did not care what she owned, and she was not going to die protecting a $100 tower. Essentials, she said aloud. Ranger watched her. That means you... His tail moved once. Claire packed her identification, financial papers, medication, water, several changes of clothes, Ranger's food, leash, and veterinary records. Then she looked at the metal box on the table. Samuel's logs and letters were already organized inside, along with the photographs and maps. She carried the entire box to the SUV and secured it behind the passenger seat. Ben came up while she was making another trip. You don't need half this stuff. I know. Then why are you carrying a frying pan? Claire looked at the pan in her hand, then laughed once despite the tension. Apparently, I'm emotionally attached to cookware. Leave it. She set it back on the counter. Ben checked the latest fire map on his phone. Winds pushing northeast. Crews are watching the road corridor. Is the old logging road usable? Claire asked. Ben looked at her sharply. Not for us, unless emergency crews direct traffic there. I know, I'm asking. Parts of it are open enough for equipment, but we follow current instructions, not Samuel's map. I understand. Claire did understand. That realization mattered. A week earlier, discovering Dawson Cutoff had made the old route feel like a secret answer hidden in history. Now, with real smoke settling into the trees, she saw the difference between understanding the past and pretending it could replace present-day emergency planning. Samuel had used the route because he knew the conditions of his time. Claire's job was simpler. Listen, prepare, leave when ordered. Ray's pickup arrived below the lookout shortly afterward. He climbed out wearing a respirator around his neck. Road's still open, he called, but they may restrict uphill traffic soon. I'm not planning to come back up if I leave. That's the correct answer. Ray looked at the stacked supplies in Claire's SUV. You got enough water? Yes. Fuel. Almost full. He nodded. Then don't wait for flames. Smoke can make that road bad enough. Claire glanced toward the tower. Do you think the fire will reach it? Ray followed her gaze. Could miss it by miles. Nobody can promise you either way. She hated the uncertainty, but trusted him more for refusing to comfort her with guesses. Your father ever talk about what people took with them during the old fire? She asked. Ray considered. Mostly kids, animals, papers, whatever was already near the door. Not furniture. Nobody outruns fire carrying a table. Claire smiled faintly. Right. Ranger suddenly barked from the SUV. Claire looked through the window and saw him standing over the hidden box as if guarding it. Ray noticed, too. That the stuff from Samuel? Yes. Then you've got the important thing. Claire looked at the tower again. She was not sure whether he meant the records or the dog. Maybe both. The air worsened through the afternoon. Smoke thickened enough that the nearest ridge faded in and out of view. Fine ash began appearing on the railing, so light Claire first mistook it for dust. She rubbed a gray fleck between her fingers. Ben saw it and checked his phone again. We're getting close. To the fire, to leaving, Claire nodded. She had already loaded everything she had decided mattered. The rest stayed. Bedding could be replaced. Tools could be replaced. The old cabinet belonged more to the lookout than to her. Even the clothes left hanging near the wall could be replaced. She stood inside the room one final time and looked at the loose floorboard Ranger had uncovered. She had screwed it back down temporarily after finding the box, leaving one scarred edge visible. That board had changed everything. Without Ranger, Claire might have spent weeks in the tower without knowing Samuel had ever existed. She touched the floor with the toe of her boot. You did good, she told Ranger. He was already waiting at the door. The evacuation order came 20 minutes later. Claire's phone sounded before Ben's did. Then both devices displayed the same instruction. Evacuate now. Dawson Ridge access area included. Claire read it once. Her stomach tightened. Ben said, Time to go. I know. Ray was already heading toward his truck. I'll follow you down, he told Claire. Ben goes behind. Why me first? Because if you stop to stare at something, we can yell at you. Comforting. Nobody laughed. Claire locked the lookout door even though she knew the gesture might be meaningless. Wind carried smoke through the trees below, and the sun had become a dim orange disk. She placed Ranger in the SUV, checked the metal box again, then stood with one hand on the driver's door. For a moment, she could not move. She had spent the last weeks fighting the idea of losing another home. The tower had been absurd, uncomfortable, cold at night, and impossible to explain to anyone sensible. Yet it was the first thing she had chosen after Michael's debt took the house. Leaving it felt too familiar. Ben stepped closer. Claire, I'm going. I know. His voice softened. But go now. She looked up at the lookout. What if it burns? Then it burns, the answer hurt. Ben continued. You're not the building. Claire looked at Ranger through the window, then at the box holding Samuel's logs, then at the papers and water already packed. She understood what he meant. When foreclosure took Michael's house, Claire had felt as though the building contained the last proof that her family had existed. Now she knew better. A home could matter without becoming something she had to die defending. Okay, she said. She got behind the wheel. The convoy began down the mountain. Visibility worsened in pockets where smoke crossed the road. Claire drove slowly but did not stop. At one bend, she could see the old logging grade disappearing north through the trees. For a second, she thought about Samuel's map, about the night he had understood that the main route might fail. Then the modern road curved away, and Claire kept following the instructions she had been given. Ash tapped lightly against the windshield. Ranger stood behind her seat until she told him to lie down.
Farther downhill, they passed an emergency vehicle heading toward the ridge. Claire gripped the steering wheel harder. No one stopped them. No road closure trapped them. Ben remained visible in her mirror. Ray's taillights stayed ahead. By the time they reached the lower valley, the smoke thinned slightly, but Claire did not relax.
She pulled into the designated safe area and parked beside the others. Only then did she look back toward Dawson Ridge. From below, the tower itself was invisible. The ridge behind it glowed faintly through the smoke. Not with visible flames everywhere, but with an unsettling red-orange reflection that pulsed against the evening haze. Claire opened the rear door. Ranger jumped down and pressed against her leg. She rested one hand on his back while the other remained on the metal box inside the SUV. Everything she had chosen to save was with her. Everything else was still on the mountain. Claire watched the red light deepen behind the ridge and realized she had no idea whether the $100 lookout would still be standing when morning came. Claire spent the night in the designated safe area, with Ranger curled beside her in the SUV and Samuel's metal box beneath her legs. Sleep came in fragments. Every time she opened her eyes, she checked her phone for updates, then looked toward Dawson Ridge, even though darkness and smoke made the mountain impossible to see. Around midnight, the wildfire crossed another drainage and crews shifted resources toward the ridge system. Later, the evacuation zone expanded farther east. Claire read each alert until the words stopped meaning anything. She kept imagining the lookout windows glowing orange, the patched plastic melting, the old wooden stairs catching one after another. By dawn, exhaustion had replaced panic. Ben appeared beside her SUV carrying 2 cups of coffee. Claire lowered the window. Any news? Crews held the fire away from the lower community. The lookout? Ben shook his head. No confirmation yet. Claire took the coffee. I hate that answer. I know. Ranger pushed his nose toward the cup. Not for you. Claire scratched his ears. Across the parking area, families who had evacuated nearby properties were waking in cars and temporary shelters. Looking at them made Samuel's letters feel suddenly less historical. Decades ago, other families had waited somewhere safer while wondering whether they had homes to return to. Claire had spent days thinking about Samuel's decision to leave the tower. Now she understood the simpler truth beneath it. He had known buildings could be replaced. People could not. By late morning, officials reported that the immediate threat to the community had eased. Fire crews had kept the main front from pushing into populated areas, though parts of the ridge remained closed. Claire was not permitted to return. She accepted that without argument. Eleanor called shortly after noon. You're safe. Yes, and Ranger Claire looked at him asleep across the back seat, complaining about accommodations. Good. I've been working on Samuel's records. Today, waiting makes me productive. Eleanor had compared the letters, Samuel's logs, Ray's father's account, archived dispatch references, and the official chronology one final time. The sequence is stronger than I thought, she said. Samuel recorded the wind shift before the evacuation route was changed. His final entries show he believed the South Road would become unsafe and that communications were failing. The family letters independently place him below the lookout morning residence. Ray's father specifically identifies Samuel directing vehicles toward the old logging road. Claire stared through the windshield. And the crews. Operational records show crews moved to protect that northern corridor as evacuation traffic was redirected. That part was always documented. What was missing was the connection between Samuel's observation and the people beginning to move before conditions worsened. Claire gripped the phone. So we know what happened. We can reconstruct it responsibly. Yes, Eleanor's wording was careful. But Claire heard the significance underneath it.
Samuel had been watching the wildfire from Dawson Ridge when the wind changed. From that height, he understood that the fire was moving toward the south evacuation route faster than people below realized. He tried to communicate the danger. When he could no longer trust the warning to reach everyone in time, he left the lookout. Samuel went down to the community himself. He warned families preparing to use the South Road and directed them toward the old logging road to the north, the route he had already marked in his notes as safe if the main road closed. People listened. Not everyone immediately, according to the letters, but enough began moving that others followed. Fire crews then reached the alternate corridor and took control, protecting it while the remaining evacuation continued. Later, conditions along the south route deteriorated exactly as Samuel had feared. "How many people did he save?" Claire asked. Eleanor paused. "I wouldn't put a number on it. The records don't support one." Claire appreciated the answer. "But people got out because he warned them. The evidence supports that his warning and redirection were an important part of the successful evacuation." The crews made the corridor usable. Residents made their own decisions. Samuel did not save a community single-handedly. He just saw something and acted. "Yes." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes that is what saving people looks like." Claire thought of Samuel's final line. "Family's clear. Crews have the road. No celebration. No claim of credit." Why did everyone forget him? Not everyone did. The families who wrote those letters remembered. Ray's father remembered. But official incident histories usually emphasize the larger operation. Samuel apparently didn't campaign for recognition. The lookout eventually closed. People moved or died, and the personal evidence stayed hidden under that floor. Until Ranger— Eleanor laughed softly. Until Ranger— 2 days passed before the evacuation order was reduced. Another day passed before the road toward Dawson Ridge reopened to property access. Claire drove up, with Ben following behind. Burn scars appeared first on distant slopes. Closer to the lookout, several patches of timber were blackened, and heat had browned vegetation along one side of the ridge. Claire drove slowly, afraid to look too far ahead. Then the tower appeared through the trees, still standing. "Oh, thank God," Ranger barked from the back seat. Claire parked before the engine had fully settled and climbed out. The lookout had not escaped untouched. Smoke stained parts of the exterior. Heat had warped some trim, and wind-driven debris had damaged another window. But the stairs remained standing. The room at the top was intact. Claire opened the door and stood inside. Her frying pan was still on the counter. She laughed so suddenly that tears followed. Ben came in behind her. "Good thing you saved that. I almost risked my life for it." "Tragic." Claire wiped her face. Ranger immediately crossed to the repaired floorboard and sniffed it. "Don't even think about it," she told him. Later that afternoon, Eleanor arrived once officials confirmed the area was safe enough for access. She brought copies of the records she had assembled. Ray came too, carrying his father's written account. They sat around the lookout table with Samuel's hidden box open between them. Eleanor arranged the evidence chronologically: Samuel's observations, the map, the last log, the letters, dispatch references, Ray's family account, the official fire chronology. For the first time, Claire could see the entire story without needing to imagine missing pieces. Her grandfather had not been a forgotten superhero. He had been a trained lookout who noticed a deadly change, refused to trust a failing communication chain, and acted before certainty arrived. That decision helped give families time to escape. Claire looked at Samuel's photograph. For weeks, the Dawson name had meant debt to her. It was the name printed on foreclosure paperwork and collection notices. Now it belonged to this too. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said. Claire looked up. More fire records? No. Eleanor reached into the metal box. When we reorganized the letters, I noticed one envelope had slipped inside the lining. She placed it on the table. Like the letters from the evacuated families, this one had never been opened. The paper was yellowed, and Samuel's handwriting crossed the front. Claire's breath caught before she even read the name. When was this written? Near the end of Samuel's life, judging by the date. Claire did not touch it immediately. Ben stood quietly near the window. Ray looked away, giving her privacy without leaving. Claire finally picked up the envelope. For days she had wanted to understand Samuel Dawson. Now she did. At least enough to know what he had done on the night people fled the wildfire. But the name on this envelope belonged to the person Claire still did not understand. The man who had inherited Samuel's history. Abandoned Idaho, buried his past, and eventually left his daughter a debt large enough to make her homeless. Written across the front in Samuel Dawson's hand were two words, Michael Dawson. Claire waited until Eleanor, Ray, and Ben had stepped away from the table before opening Samuel's letter. No one actually left the lookout, but they gave her the closest thing the small room allowed to privacy. Eleanor moved toward the western windows. Ray went outside to inspect the heat damage along the stairs. Ben crouched beside Ranger near the door. Claire remained at the table with the yellowed envelope in both hands. Michael Dawson was written across the front in the same handwriting that filled the fire logs. For weeks, Claire had been searching for an explanation of Samuel. Now she was afraid the explanation of her father might hurt more. She slid one finger beneath the flap and unfolded the letter. Samuel had written it late in life, after Michael had already left Idaho. The first lines were ordinary. He hoped Michael was healthy. He had heard indirectly that his son was working and trying to build a life elsewhere. Then the tone changed. Samuel admitted that people still approached him about the wildfire, still thanked him for what happened on the ridge, and that he had begun to understand what those stories had done inside his own home. Claire stopped reading. Ranger crossed the room and rested his head against her knee. She placed one hand between his ears and continued. Samuel wrote that Michael had grown up hearing strangers describe his father as brave, dependable, even heroic. Samuel had accepted their gratitude without realizing that his son heard something different, a standard he believed he was expected to meet. The letter contained no accusation. Samuel blamed himself for not recognizing the distance sooner. One sentence made Claire close her eyes. You were never required to become me. She read it again. Samuel wrote that surviving one terrible night did not make him a better man than his son. He had made mistakes Michael knew better than strangers did. He regretted allowing the community's memory of the wildfire to become larger than their relationship. Whatever Michael chose to do with his life, Samuel wanted him to know that being ordinary was not failure. Claire lowered the letter. Suddenly she could hear her father's voice from years earlier. We're managing. He had said it whenever bills arrived, whenever the car needed repairs, whenever Claire noticed him calculating grocery prices in his head. Michael had always behaved as though admitting difficulty would make him smaller. She had assumed it was pride. Maybe it had been, but now she could see where some of that pride might have begun. Ben glanced toward her. You okay? Claire nodded, then shook her head. I don't know. He waited. Samuel told my dad he didn't have to be like him. Ben looked at the letter. Did your dad ever get it? Claire examined the envelope. It was still here. The realization hurt. Samuel had written the words Michael might have needed, but they had remained inside the lookout. Whether Samuel had intended to send the letter and failed, or simply never found the courage, Claire could not know. She refused to invent an answer.
What she did know was that Michael had spent his adult life far from Dawson Ridge and almost never spoke about his father.
He had built a modest life with Claire, then watched financial problems accumulate while hiding them behind the same phrase, "We're managing." Claire looked at Michael's photograph beside Samuel's. He still should have told me about the debt. Eleanor turned from the window. Yes. Claire appreciated that there was no qualification attached. He should have told me before it got that bad. He should have let me know we could lose the house. Her eyes burned. I was his daughter. I deserved the truth. You did, Eleanor said. Claire folded Samuel's letter carefully. Understanding Michael did not erase what he had done. His shame had become her foreclosure notice. His silence had left her homeless at 20. She did not need to turn that into love or sacrifice simply because she had discovered where some of his fear came from. But neither did she need to keep imagining that Michael had hidden everything because she did not matter enough to tell. He had been afraid of being a failure, and by hiding that fear he had caused exactly the damage he was trying to conceal. Claire looked at Samuel's photograph again. One, Dawson had been remembered as a hero. Another had spent his life believing he could never measure up. Now Claire stood between their stories. She did not have to become either one. In the weeks after the wildfire, the lookout slowly became livable again. Ben helped replace the damaged window and showed Claire how to repair warped trim. True to form, he made her do most of the work herself. "You're enjoying this," Claire accused while struggling with a stubborn screw. "Teaching independence, watching me swear at hardware?" That too. Ray helped clear debris from the access road and checked the damaged railing. Eleanor worked with the local historical archive to preserve copies of Samuel's fire logs, maps, photographs, letters, and the supporting records. Claire agreed immediately. With one condition. The originals stay with me. They should, Eleanor said. They're your family papers. Hearing that still felt strange. Family papers. Claire had spent most of her life believing the Dawson family history began with Michael and ended with her. Now it filled a metal box. The archive prepared a small historical display about the old wildfire. It did not call Samuel the man who single-handedly saved a town. Claire insisted on that. The account described what the evidence actually showed. Samuel observed the dangerous wind shift from Dawson Ridge, recognized that the southern evacuation route was threatened, left the lookout when communications became unreliable, warned residents directly, and helped redirect families toward the old logging road before fire crews secured the evacuation corridor. Ray contributed his father's account. Eleanor supplied the archival chronology. The letters provided the voices of the families who had made it out. Samuel Dawson's name finally appeared where it had been missing, not as a legend, but as a man who noticed danger and acted when people needed him. Claire kept working on the lookout. There was no sudden fortune waiting for her. The $100 purchase remained a weathered tower requiring constant repairs. She found temporary work in town and saved what she could. Some weeks she repaired one thing only to discover two more problems. But the place was hers by choice, and that distinction mattered. One evening, after Ben and Ray had driven down the mountain and the last light stretched across the Idaho forest, Claire sat beside the windows with Ranger at her feet. The loose floorboard had been secured properly. The metal box no longer belonged beneath it. It sat openly on the table. Claire placed Samuel's letter beside a photograph of Michael. For a while she looked at both men. She could admire Samuel without turning him into the impossible figure Michael had feared. She could love Michael without pretending his secrecy had been harmless. Their choices belonged to them. What she carried forward belonged to her. Outside,
The ridges were green and black, where the recent wildfire had marked them.
But the evening sky was finally clear of smoke.
Claire remembered the foreclosure notice arriving 18 days after Michael died. Back then, inheritance had seemed like a cruel word. It meant debt, secrets, a house taken away, a problem passed from a dead parent to a living child. The hidden box had not given her money to repay that debt. It had given her something less measurable and, somehow,
more useful, the truth that her family was larger than its worst mistake. Samuel had left behind evidence of responsibility. Michael had left behind evidence of what shame could do when it remained hidden. Claire could learn from both. Ranger shifted in his sleep, one paw touching the floorboard he had once scratched open. Claire smiled and looked around the repaired lookout she had bought for $100 because nobody else wanted it. She had come to Dawson Ridge looking only for somewhere she could sleep without being told to leave. Instead, she had found a grandfather erased from her family conversations, a father she understood differently without excusing, and a history that no longer had to remain buried beneath the floor. Claire looked once more at Samuel's letter, then at Michael's photograph. Some inheritances arrived as bills. Some arrived as stories. Some were warnings about mistakes not to repeat. And some were simply unfinished things placed into your hands, waiting for you to decide what they would mean. Claire turned toward the darkening Idaho horizon. For the first time since losing her home, she understood that she did not have to carry everything her family had left behind. She only had to choose what was worth carrying forward.